Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we look at the political landscape across the pond and south of the border. In the second half of our show, we'll speak with career diplomat Todd Huizinga, Director of International Outreach at the Acton Institute, whose new book, The New Totalitarian Temptations, paints a chilling picture of the slow demise of democratic self-rule at the hands of global elites. Up first, we ran into Gloria Alvarez at the recent CPAC conference, and I had to sit down with her on Radio Row to see what was on her mind. Alvarez is a political scientist, radio broadcaster, and project director at the National Civic Movement of Guatemala. Gloria, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill. It's an honor to be here.
Gloria, I understand you have Hungarian and Cuban roots, which is an interesting combination. How did you end up in Guatemala, and in particular at the University Francisco Marroquin?
Well, I was born in Guatemala. My dad is Cuban, and he never went back after seven years. It was the last time that he was there. My mom is half Guatemalan, half Hungarian. Mm-hmm. There are stories that maybe my grandfather from Hungary was actually like working against the Soviet Union, and that's how he got to escape. Yeah, he got out. And they ended up in Guatemala for different motives. My grandparents from Cuba, they offered them a job over there, or returning to Cuba, which was not an option for them. From the side of my mom, because her mom, my grandmother, was from there.
Mm-hmm. And did you grow up in Guatemala City or out in the countryside?
I grew up in Guatemala City, and we also moved around in Central America, in El Salvador and Honduras, because of my dad's work. And then I went back to Guatemala when I was 16 years old. So yeah, it also helped me to be the new girl and seeing different cultures, even though Central America is pretty similar, but still there are differences.
And you were educated at University Francisco Marroquin, which is quite a unique place.
Yeah, it is. I actually chose Francisco Marroquin not knowing the libertarian background of it, the
Really?
uniqueness of it. Yeah, I didn't know. But it was the only option that I respected to study international affairs and political science. So once I got into that, Francisco Marroquin has a program about law and economics, public choice, Mises philosophy, Hayek philosophy, that it doesn't matter what you study, you have to go through those courses.
Curriculum.
Yeah.
So let's dig in a little bit to Guatemalan history. Most Americans have only the haziest knowledge of the Civil War that racked the country for over 30 years. I mean, it ended in 96. How has the country fared since then?
Well, as much of Latin America, we had a guerrilla that got inspired with the Cuban Revolution and wanted to emulate that. So in 96, when we finally signed the peace agreements, they were signed with a lot of commitments that have never been put in place. So this created a discomfort in between society, and former guerrilla members are now gang members, so you have common violence still.
Right.
And even though that the left wing didn't win the violent war, they did win the intellectual war. So you see in TV, in radio, in newspapers, the left wing ideology is way more accepted by the society, and also they are now in different government positions. You can see them in the judicial, in the legislative, in the executive branches. And since we signed the peace agreements with amnesty, then no one got really punished, you know.
Well, populism is a problem all across Latin America. In fact, it probably reached its peak expression there. I mean, it's devastated economies of one country after another, the most recent victims being the citizens of Venezuela, which you can hardly a day goes by you don't see about their misery in the news. What is it about the history and culture of Latin America that makes it so susceptible to populist movements?
Well, there are various explanations. I like one that Acemoglu and Robinson touch in their book, Why Nations Fail. And it's basically the difference on how institutions in the United States were formed versus Latin America. In Latin America, everything that was claimed in the name of the king. People got used to not working for themselves, but towards being part of a system of privileges where the more loyal you were to the king, then the more things you got. And that survived our Spanish independence, because then the new caudillos, the new leaders, adopted the same Spanish tradition instead of breaking with it. So we have had dictators in every aspect of ideologies, from military to left. And there's always the mentality of having this messiah, this leader that is going to take care of everyone in society. We are very paternalistic in that sense, and we are still carrying myths such as wealth should be transferred. It's not something that is created with the mind. That law is an instrument to divide and have privileges instead of being an instrument of, be equal to every single one of us. So there are a lot of psychological and cultural impediments that Latin Americans don't even see. And they come to this country running away from that. They come here with not knowing it, but what they're looking for is rule of law. They're looking for a system, a republic that respects their life, liberty, and private property as never has been the case back home.
Let's look a little bit more into the history of the caudillos, the big man in Latin America, again, following the tradition of Spanish imperialism. There have been so many examples of failure, one after another, after another, after another. Why does no one learn from history?
Because they don't study history. We don't study history. Like the education system is really poor in Latin America. People don't understand the correlation of memorizing data from history and actually using that information to analyze what's going on in reality. So they always think that the new guy is going to be different. Fidel Castro was different, and then Hugo Chavez was different from Castro, and then the National Assembly of Venezuela with the opposition, who also calls themselves socialists, they're going to be different. And it's like, if you don't learn from history, then you're going to inevitably repeat it.
Castro and the Castro brothers are the longest ruling dictators in the world. Do they still cast a shadow over Latin America?
Absolutely. Actually, populism in the 21st century was the machinery that Castro built after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because all the finance for the left-wing parties, the guerrillas, the Marxist social society came from the USSR. So once the USSR collapses, Cuba is left with no money, and they need to rush up in knowing what they're going to do. And there was another thing that imposed that change. It was that most of us stop having military dictatorships and we enter in civil democracies for the first time. So it didn't have sense to be violent when now you can actually make your communist party run in elections and win democratically. So because of these changes, Castro gets along with Brazilian Union leader Lula da Silva, and they form the Forum of Sao Paulo, where they make the agenda of the socialism of the 21st century. And their first disciple was Hugo Chavez. So once Chavez gets in Venezuela, petroleum oil money
fuels everything
instead of Soviet Union.
Of course, it's broken now with oil down to $40 a barrel.
Yeah, but they're already looking for their the C plan, and the C plan is Colombia is signing peace agreements with FARC. And so I think that where it's moving is that socialism of the 21st century will now be financed through drugs.
Through drug money instead of oil.
Yeah.
So what do you make of the Obama administration's outreach to the Castro brothers?
Well, I think it's very dangerous. I mean, those are the kind of political schemes that politicians pull out when they're about to leave office, so they can be remembered in history books as being so grateful and so kind to, the Cuban people in this case. But I don't think it's going to change anything in real life, because everything that goes inside Cuban island is going to be controlled by the state mercantilism of Castro. So even if Obama and the United States establish relations, it's going to be like the relations that Spain already has with the island, which is like this crony capitalism that only benefits them.
So what happens after the Castros die?
Well, I think that after Castro dies, of course, the great leader, the great messiah comes down. And I hope that we can see history repeating itself as it did with the death of Stalin in the USSR, or the death of Mao Zedong, and the rise up of Deng Xiaoping, who was really smart in not endangering Mao's image, but he still was very efficient in changing the economic policy 180 degrees. So I hope that happens with Cuba, that once the real leader dies, then things start slowly to change.
Let's dig into that comparison a little bit more, particularly China-Cuba. It's not one I've thought about. China has a very long history, and these are extremely entrepreneurial, industrious people. communism was an aberration in China. It was a mere 70 years through all their history. In fact, if you look at the Chinese diaspora, they provided the entrepreneurs and the business people for all of Asia during that time. Much like Cuba sent their entrepreneurs to the United States, who's left in Cuba to rekindle the spirit of entrepreneurism?
Well, there are some leaders, but they don't have the economic knowledge. They only have the thirst for civil liberties, freedom of expression, freedom of emigrating and coming in and out the island. You have bloggers like Yoani Sanchez, Yusnavi Peris, Yelki Puig. These are young people who have gathered a place through social media. They protect themselves with social media. They denounce the corruption of the regime, but they still don't have a straight clarity about how the economic system should work. So if you put them in a debate with any left-wing politician, of course, they're not going to win. But I think that it depends on the training of these young leaders, such as in Eastern Europe after the fall of Soviet Union. Then you had to, train people in these ideas like Václav Klaus and leaders like that.
So, Gloria, let's dig a little deeper into the machinery of populism. This is something you study and speak about quite a bit. It seems to be very important to create a highly polarized environment, usually with very high-profile victims. How does this work, and how do you fight against it?
Well, as we were discussing on our previous segment, it all comes from the photo of Sao Paulo and the agenda of the socialism of the 21st century. So this is really a strategy. It's not something that just happens by coincidence. And the first step in this handbook is, as you say, polarizing society, dividing it into collective groups.
Identity groups.
Identity groups that are the people, el pueblo, and the anti-people, el anti-pueblo. So, of course, the people are poor, are humble, are indigenous. They are never wrong with the leader that they choose. They are never guilty of anything that happens in the country, and people need to be taken care of because people is too weak, people is too poor, and people is too ignorant. And then you have anti-people. These are the people who are rich because someone else is poor. These are the people who gather all the money and all the natural resources in one hand. They are the responsibles of the United States coming in, or having disparities and inequalities in economy. So the populist uses this discourse basically to divide society with hatred. And when you have a society where everyone hates each other and it's like not trusting each other, then this Messiah comes and say, I will help you, I will take care of every single aspect of society, the orphans, the elderly, the environment. And since people are in this apathy of doing something, to like build this strong society, they say, yeah, sure, why not? I just have to vote for this guy and he'll take care of everything.
Well, in truth, you have fewer examples of the Steve Jobs kind of entrepreneur in Latin America, and you do have your crony capitalists, your crony corporatists down there. Corruption is we complain about corruption here in the U.S., but the scale of corruption in Latin America is so much larger there. Is there any hope of rooting out corruption, or is that pretty much a permanent feature of Latin American life?
There is hope, but we have to change the way we think of concepts. Latin America won't advance in be more transparent if we keep on blaming the corporate person or the entrepreneur for all of our mistakes. In Latin America, being an entrepreneur, being a businessman is bad seen. So if that's bad seen, people go to the government to get rich with someone else's money. So if we don't change that discourse, then I don't think that things can change. And the other thing is, of course, government has become a mine gold for those who won't stand in their own feet and for those who are not willing to compete,
How has the U.S. made things worse over the years for the people in Latin America?
Well, because the U.S. doesn't have a clear agenda. And so after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we were a priority, and there was USAID coming in, giving foreign aid money, which doesn't work. What we need is more job opportunities. And then when 9/11 came, we stopped being the spotlight. You guys went to the Middle East. Then Obama comes in. We kind of get like abandoned, which I don't want to use that word because I think we are responsible of our own problems. We shouldn't wait until the United States to rescue us or have an agenda, a clear agenda. But the problem is, with no agenda and watching the U.S. as having internal debates on what their foreign policy should be, I think that the U.S. should first analyze what is exactly that they want to do and then do it, instead of walking 2 steps and then coming back one and improvising, because that's even worse.
Well, we don't know what's coming next. We have an election in the fall. There's going to be a new foreign policy no matter how you look at it.
Definitely.
What are you hopeful for?
There's really I hope that the legislative branch and the judicial branch stay strong for the sake of the republic and the limits of government and the division of powers, because by the presidential candidates that I'm seeing, I'm
a little scared.
Yeah.
What role does free trade play in political and economic reform?
Oh, it's such an important role. If we would have free trade, then opportunities would influx in Latin America, and not by state mercantilism, but actually by competition and job opportunities. So if any foreign policy I would recommend would be that one of free trade.
Well, Chile went through an interesting transition with what they called the Chicago Boys when they re-engineered their economy. Of course, it was under a dictator, and there was a lot of problems, but focus on that a little bit and remind us the history of things that changed in Chile.
Well, Chile was about to become an ex-Cuba with Allende, and of course then you have the intervention of the United States. Pinochet comes along, and they implement a lot of reforms, privatizations, reduction of state intervention, a lot of protectionisms went down.
They privatized Social Security.
They privatized Social Security, they privatized education as well with voucher system, and Chile then started giving the rest of Latin America a huge example.
Sure.
The problem is they did it under a dictatorship, so that created a lot of cultural resentment.
Sure.
So nowadays you have, for example, communist leader Camila Vallejo, and she wants to take it all out, and she speaks about free education and free healthcare, and this notion that things are free, that we haven't understood that the government has no money unless the money that it takes from us. So
we have some of that going on here too.
Yeah, it's really worrisome, because after 200 years of our republics, starting, instead of watching the United States and its original principles, being implemented in Latin America, what I'm watching in these U.S. elections, it's more similar to what I see back home.
It is.
And it saddens me.
Yeah, we're starting to see populism on both parties right now. What's going on in Argentina? There seem to be some interesting changes taking place.
Well, Argentina, after 12 years of Nestor and Cristina Kirchner and all this handbook of the populists, taking place, Mauricio Macri gets elected. The first thing he does is he liberalizes the dollar. He started firing a lot of public functionaries that were not efficient. He started closing public offices. People are really angry in Argentina, of course, because as Ayn Rand said, you can evade reality, but you cannot evade the consequences of evading reality. So now Argentinians are, watching the consequences of so many years of evading reality. There is inflation, there is unemployment, there is discontent within the society, but I think that Mauricio Macri is doing the shock therapy that in the long term it's better. Historically speaking, it was better for Eastern European countries to act quickly. Whereas, for example, in Venezuela, everyone is celebrating that the opposition got a majority in parliament, but then you have Lilian Tintori, the wife of Leopoldo López, one of the biggest oppositors of the regime, saying that they come from a left-wing party, that they are members of the International Socialist. So I don't see any lights in Venezuela.
Well, let's stick with those two countries in comparison. I mean, Argentina looks like it's about to rejoin the world financial system. They just paid off the bankrupt bond holdouts after, 20 years of waiting for their money?
Yeah.
And it looks like they're going to be welcomed back into the economic community. Compare that to Venezuela. Is there any hope of turning things around in Venezuela without bloodshed and violence?
I don't think so, because there's not a real opposition. There's no one there that is actually have the capacity and the courage of saying that only free market can cure socialism. It's like you're watching meat-eating socialists versus vegan-eating socialists, but it's socialism, and you cannot cure cancer with an aspirin. And Venezuela is in a really critical position, and what the opposition is offering is aspirins.
So, Gloria, tell us about the National Civic Movement that you're involved with. What are its goals?
Well, the goals are basically rescuing the republic, reestablishing life, liberty, and private property as the individual rights in Guatemala.
That's a pretty tall order.
It is. It was a movement that was formed in the streets after the assassination of a lawyer, and he left a video that went viral saying that the president was responsible for his death. Wow. And this mobilized society. So the National Civic Movement was born to supply the demand that the political parties back home were not supplying, which is empowering the citizens, making all these intellectual efforts, conferences, debates, reunions, so that people in Guatemala know what government do they have and know their rights.
You know, your speeches have made you a bit of a YouTube sensation. What role do new technologies play in educating people about the values of liberty?
A really primary role, especially if you come from a region like mine where the public education only teaches Marxism and Keynesianism. I think that the fact that we are living for the first time in history with all the information that as humanity we have gathered in the palm of our hands make us more empowered than anywhere else in history. So I think that not all the people who have smartphones are using them as the power tool that it could be. Mm-hmm. And I hope that as time goes by, people start seeing that their best teacher is internet, and that they can actually use this to rebel against any system that only teaches them what they are interested in you to knowing.
You're an activist now. Do you see politics in your future?
Yeah, but I first focus on creating a demand for my libertarian ideas, because otherwise if I run in politics I would have to commit to the left or the right, which are not sufficient for me. So I'm first trying to implement the libertarian ideas in a continent that pretty much doesn't know them, and then maybe.
And what role does the University Francisco Marroquín play in all this?
Well, it's a very important role, because actually Universidad Francisco Marroquín is a safe haven for free market ideas all over the world. In Guatemala, of course, it's hated by these left-wing cultural intellectuals as the bourgeois university, the elitist one. But the central role it has worldwide is really important, because it gathers together the best academics, the best intellectuals. It also teaches businessmen to stop being crony, because at the long run it's
got a
not
good entrepreneurship program.
Yeah.
They try to encourage that.
Yeah.
Well, Gloria, the people of Guatemala are fortunate that you're young and full of energy. You've got a long road ahead of you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Bill. It was a pleasure.
That was Gloria Alvarez from the National Civic Movement of Guatemala, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, which the New York Times has called an invaluable tool for anyone interested in politics or public affairs. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. We'd like to take a moment to thank our long-term sponsor, Old Boston Restorations, for their support. Old Boston is a boutique property management company located in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.net. Ahead, we'll speak with career diplomat Todd Huizinga, Director of International Outreach at the Acton Institute, about his new book, The New Totalitarian Temptations, Global Governance and the Crisis of Democracy in Europe. Stay tuned.